What's good, everyone? Welcome back into MLS Digest. We're here to do our mid-season power rankings since we're officially halfway through the season with most of, if not all, teams playing 17 games of the 34-match schedule in the regular season. And I'm recording this currently during Sunday night's matches. There's still a couple matches going on with LAFC Kansas City and Sounders Whitecaps, but regardless, there's only been 5 matches in this weekend's slate, and one match is not going to really change my opinions on the current power rankings as they stand. And obviously, with these, you have to take into account not just the current standings and where teams are specifically in their respective conferences, because number one, a lot of those, in those cases, a lot of teams are really grouped up, and one team might be 2 spots above the other, but it's really only about a point or two difference at the moment. For example, you have to take into account current form and especially the outlook on what this form now means going forward into the second half of the season, and kind of what the expectations are to close out this season. And so there's a lot of factors that go into this, and obviously everyone's going to disagree anyways, and there's a lot of parity in MLS regardless. So the lists are going to be completely different, or you're going to have slight disagreements about where teams are going to go in certain spots, but relatively there shouldn't be too much disagreement, I would say, about most teams in specific, I guess, groups of 5-6 spots when it comes to these types of lists at the moment. And regardless, we're going to get into all of that. Please make sure to like this video down below and subscribe to the channel if you're new. We're looking at 400 subscribers and keep going as we get into this second half of the MLS season. So we start things off with my bottom 10 of the power rankings. We're going to do this in 3 chunks, right? In 10, since there's 30 teams in the league, starting from the bottom. And in 30th, I don't think there's much of a debate here. CF Montreal, only them and LA Galaxy are the teams remaining with just 1 win on the season. But Montreal gets bumped to dead last here just because of the fact of the talent on this roster and the fact that their win came much long ago compared to the Galaxy, who finally broke that streak to start the season. But Montreal, of course, as we know, infamously terrible owners in terms of spending, investing in the team. Fired Courtois. Now it's the interim Don Adel, who had an okay stretch to start his tenure as the caretaker manager. But since then, since beating NYCFC, just, of course, getting maybe a couple draws here and there, but nothing doing really for this squad. And in general, of course, why I bumped them down to compared to the Galaxy is because of the outlook going forward. This roster is super young for the most part. They brought in Vrioni, and in that 2-striker system with Owusu, I mean, they've kind of had a decent partnership, but it just hasn't been enough to get the results because from top to bottom, this roster is just not good enough. And at the same time, you have players like Caden Clark, Bryce Duke, who have potential. And of course, Caden Clark had a great end to last season, but they've been injured in, chunks as well of the season. And this roster just hasn't had, been fully fit for long periods of time to even maybe climb up the standings in any sort of sense. And so that's why I have Montreal as dead last. Just going forward, I don't see this changing much compared to the Galaxy, which we'll get to, have just a little bit of hope of recovering some ground. As for the Galaxy, have them in 29th. Once again, just 1 win on the season. They just beat RSL in their most recent match at home to snap the streak. And Paintsel and Peck are finally back once again after picking up injuries for the second or third time, respectively. And there's just a little bit more hope with this squad. The talent, especially on this roster, if they continue to stay healthy, just has that potential to, maybe make a very, very late push for one of these wild card spots. But still, they're just so far down, right, that it would take a second half that would match the likes of, the Union or the Whitecaps, what they've done so far in the first half of the season. It would take that type of effort to even potentially get back into these final playoff spots. And That's a big ask, but still, there's so much talent on this roster from an attacking standpoint. And Ricky Puig, who knows just how long it'll be until he's back and how many games he can play for this squad. And that just boosts them just a little bit. But that's also not saying much, right? They're 29th for a reason. And, there just hasn't been that cohesiveness whatsoever from these cup champs because they've had to sell so many players. And, this roster just hasn't meshed with the replacements. And so while I think there's a little bit of hope for this squad going forward, they deservedly have to say here one win hasn't changed what has been an embarrassing first half of 2025 for the 2024 Cup champs. Toronto in 28th, and they're statistically the third worst team on wins this season, tied with St. Louis City. And they were one of my wooden spoon contenders early before the season. And if it weren't for LA and Montreal being generationally and historically bad, then they would probably be getting that this year. But it looks like they'll, just scrape by probably. And even though Insigne and Bernadeschi have been honestly relatively healthy, and I don't feel like there's been that much drama around, either of them, and just actually being available, right? The attacking output just hasn't been consistent enough anyways. Brynhildsen has come and he hasn't been, consistent enough, whether that be with form and with health especially, because Kerr as well has been injured. And just besides that fact, Robin Fraser just hasn't gotten the best out of what is just honestly an aging roster, not that good of a roster. And a lot of Canadian national team players on this team anyways who are getting call-ups, but it just hasn't meshed together. And for a squad that was really dominant about, 6 years ago plus, right, and had a good stretch of around 5 years, this organization has really fallen off, and it has continued this year. And I just don't see that changing. The East is really, really tough especially, and that also knocks them down, I guess, just below St. Louis in that regard, because I just don't see them getting a chance against some of these other even lower East teams to kind of compete for one of those wild card spots when it all comes down to it at the end of the season. Moving on to St. Louis City, which fired Olaf Melberg and is now with the caretaker manager David Critchley. And at the time of this recording, they also just lost today to the Timbers on the road after actually going up 1-0, and honestly they looked pretty decent in that game. And it was really just the continued theme of this season, which was that the finishing in that game was absolutely terrible, and they probably should have been up multiple goals even earlier than the one that they did score. But that's just the St. Louis City team for you. But I think under Critchley we're seeing just a little bit more bravery in possession, and just maybe a little bit more of confidence, right? But that the finishing just has to improve. João Klaus, Simon Betcher today was absolutely shocking as well in that Timbers match, I mean. And just, from this whole season standpoint, I mean, this is one of the best markets in the league outside of, your huge markets, right? But the performances just haven't been there. City Park has been longing for getting back to that success in the inaugural season, and it just hasn't come. So there's also been a ton of injuries to this squad, and then Lewin, dealing with his personal issues, has not been around for a consistent amount of games, and that leaves another hole in midfield in terms of that kind of consistency, in terms of being able to actually play in possession and having the quality in midfield. And so in the West, I think still anything is possible, right? I don't think it's as big of a gap as, say, for the Galaxy. But once again, we're already into the second half now, and each game, if they don't start getting a couple of wins in a row, it's really going to feel like it's a lost season sooner rather than later. RSL is in 26th for me, and they've just been, once again, shocking as well when you compare it to last season, and especially that fall off from the summer of last season when they had the fire sale and this roster completely got restructured. It's been, just a tremendous fall off for this team that had such a great attacking, trio or quartet. But the only player really remaining is Diego Luna, and if it weren't for him, this team would probably be 30th. I'm not gonna lie, like they'd be really battling with Montreal for the spoon at the moment. And he's been an absolute star. He's taking his game to another level, and that's really the only reason to watch RSL games this season. And he's gotten his U.S. call-ups now for the Gold Cup, and so they're really going to be struggling without him, even more so. And once again, in the West, they're only at the moment 7 points off a playoff spot. So, I'm not putting it out of question, but this attack just doesn't have consistent enough strikers. They signed Agata from Kansas City. They have Piol, and I still, once again, just haven't seen enough quality from Gonçalves or Marchuk to think that this team can just turn it around and develop just that killerness together to kind of string together some kind of run. So, yeah, Luna has really been carrying this team, and that's been fun to watch for sure, especially since he is a U.S. international, and you love to tune into those types of players on these teams. But as far as the season goes, I just don't see this turning around for RSL. Next up in 25th, and we're really just clutching at straws here, right? Because separating these bottom 10, and especially the current crop that I'm in, this segment of like 3 or 4 teams, is honestly just so minuscule. You can maybe order it around a little bit however you'd like, but some of this also has to do with just a little bit of better form and why they've maybe risen a couple spots in my power rankings. And for DC United, they have had a little bit of better form, right? They turned around from their 4-game scoreless streak to tie against the Revs, who have been really in a revival, right? Since the first 6 or 7 weeks of the season. Those past 10 games have been, I think they're on a 9-game unbeaten streak, so we'll get to them. But regardless, so that's a good draw in their books, especially since they've been missing Benteke. And then also beating a Cincinnati team, which regardless of how their form is at the moment, is very tough to do. And, but then the good thing about making this video a little bit later than I wanted to is that they did play in this past weekend, week 18, and they lost 7-1 to the Fire. But obviously, once again, both teams had heavily rotated squads due to international call-ups, injuries, and once again, they're still missing Benteke. So Pirani has been another bright spot. Of course, they're number 10, but there's just not much talent outside of that on this team from an attacking standpoint. And there's really not much more to say. The front office as well, letting Click go in the offseason. It's just not a serious organization at the moment from a roster building standpoint, from a commitment to the roster, to spending on quality players, right? So I don't see this getting much better. Once again, the East is a much tougher conference, so it's going to be really hard for some of these lower teams in the East compared to the West, I believe, to make any sort of turnaround and challenge for playoff spots. FC Dallas in 24th. Dallas currently sitting 11th in the West. And honestly, I think my preseason prediction for them was to be in one of those wild card spots, and they're only 4 points off of it. So it's nothing too disappointing for me, I guess, but it's still been a little bit of a disappointment because I don't think this Musa Acosta kind of battery ram and connection from an attacking standpoint has been as, we've seen as much fireworks as we could be, and that's been a bit of a letdown so far. Also, Julio Santos, you have Pedrinho. Those have been 2 other standouts, right? But still, they just haven't fully put it together on a match-to-match basis. And especially at home, they've been very disappointing. And it doesn't help when half of your home stadium is getting renovated throughout the season, so you can have a full crop of fans to cheer you on and provide that type of atmosphere. And so Dallas, the good thing about MLS, right, is that 18 teams across both conferences out of the 30 are going to make the playoffs / play in. And so even though Dallas is 24th, they're kind of still hovering around where I had them to end the season, and they'll probably just have enough to creep into those wild card spots just because of the front end talent they have. I think defensively they did have gotten and been a little bit better than last season, but it's just about turning that home form around for me if they want to sneak into the 9 or 8 spot. In 23rd, I have Atlanta United, and Atlanta, as I've discussed plenty of times on the weekly episodes and previews, has been a massive disappointment. One of the top 2 teams alongside Austin, which we'll get to very shortly, is that, in terms of spending, and the product hasn't delivered on the field, but they have gotten some good results against very good East teams in Cincinnati and Orlando at home, before then losing on the road to Red Bulls, who have been a middling Eastern team and an inconsistent one as well on the road. And that's a place they've never won, so maybe not too much of a surprise there, but they were entering that match in the good form off those 2 other wins. So once again, a little bit back down to earth for Atlanta, and could still obviously certainly contend for one of those play-in spots or the 7th spot. But this was a team that was propped up, and by me, predicted to be the Supporter Shield contender and even winner. And it's just not been a good season whatsoever. The players with Almiron, with Moranchuk, and et cetera, just outside of Latelat, really, no one's really been that consistent and hasn't really looked all that comfortable in the roles and the areas of the pitch they're asked to being played. And it seems like a lot of players are kind of overlapping and getting into each other's kind of space and positions. And that's been a frustrating thing when it's come down to getting in those final link-up plays in the final third. So Atlanta has the talent for sure, but it's about the game isn't played on paper as they say, and they have to figure it out. Surely, I think not even making the playoffs would be an absolute disaster. I don't think that happens. And so, there's certainly been worse teams than them, but they, can't just be given the benefit of the doubt at this point, because it's already half the season and they have to show us some sort of revival if they want to be considered any higher. In 22nd, I have Austin FC. And did you know that Austin's 13 goals on the season, including now the win over the Rapids they just had this weekend at the time of recording with 2 goals. So before that match, they had 11 goals. And honestly, I was planning on doing this video before that. So did you know that those 13 goals are only above Montreal's 12 goals? So they have the second worst goal tally in the league. They've given up only 20 goals though, right? And they sit in 7th in the Western standings. So you would think maybe, why do you have them this low, right? They're sitting in an all right spot at the moment, and they play pretty risk-free soccer, right? But that's the problem. They spend so much money on this attack that, despite the fact that, yes, they are focusing from a defensive side of the ball, it just has to be better from an attacking standpoint. Brandon Vasquez, who has had one of the best seasons we've seen from a striker in the past 5+ years in this league, when he was with Cincinnati, coming back to MLS, and now you sign Uzuni, Bukhari, and nothing's clicking. It's not good enough, right? And Austin's been really begging for this type of spark in attack for years now. And, to only be scoring 13 goals through 18 games for Austin that it's played, right? Not even 17. That's not good enough. You can't just be relying on these 1-goal games throughout, because one of these times you're going to get burnt. And even if you do make the playoffs as one of these lower seeds, you're not going to be hosting the home game, right? Or the majority of the home games, if in the best of 3 series, first round, for example. And the probability is that the luck is not going to go your way, because there's a lot of really good attacking teams in this league, especially on the higher end of things, even though the West may be a little bit weaker. But you're just really playing with fire here, and I'm not all that impressed with Austin because their style is just so boring. And unless they show me more on the other side of the ball, I don't really care what their standing is. To close out this bottom 10, I have Sporting KC. And since firing Peter Vermees, they have been very, very tough to beat. And they've gone on currently now a very long road stretch. They're currently playing at LAFC, and we'll see what the end result is there. But regardless of that, entering that match, they've been in really, really good form with a lot of road games and finding ways to get out some points out of it. And that's a real good positive for this team. They're sitting in 12th and 6 points below that play-in playoff line, which is obviously still recoverable, right? We have half the season, but Joveljic has been in really good form, and this team just seems to be clicking a little bit more. It seems like they're definitely more committed from the defensive side of the ball when they go up against these really, electric attacking teams. They really are playing for each other, and I think that's a really good sign when it comes down to the wear and tear of this season, especially when you have Leagues Cup coming up and other teams, especially the better teams, in just maybe a couple more competitions than Kansas City is in. I think that will benefit them if they continue to really show this type of energy and match teams, despite the fact maybe not having as much of a talented roster as some of these teams in the West. I think they definitely have a possibility, if they continue this form and mindset, to really continue making noise and just generally causing problems for teams that would be putting them away very easily earlier on this season. We move on into the middle section of these power rankings, 20 through 11th, and we start with the Dynamo in 20th. Now, the Dynamo have really picked up form. I feel like they've definitely made pretty good work of their Texas rivals, especially in the past month and a half or so, and have won those derbies. And since Linger came, this attack has definitely looked much better. It's really gotten Ponce involved a lot more. Jack McGlynn has, I feel like, scored a handful of goals this season, and he's really been the difference maker in a couple of games for this team. And so they're sitting 2 points off this playoff line at the moment in 10th in the West. And, despite the fact that I'm just generally wasn't and not all that high on this team in terms of being, a contender for one of these, anything above like 7th, Ben Olsen just, I guess, sort of finds a way to just get this team to be difficult to beat, even though this roster is, as constructed, not all that great compared to like 2 years ago for sure. But you also have a couple of the players coming back who are injured at the moment, who have been out all season, and they're expected back in these summer months, especially the wing players. And so that can add a little bit of verticality and just that dynamic element to this attack. But with how weak this West is, the Dynamo have been showing some good enough form, right? They won at New York, but then also lost to Kansas City on the return game in that midweek weekend kind of action. And so once again, it's kind of like, I can see them lower in other people's rankings and higher, and this goes the same for other teams. It's just like we're kind of just debating these minuscule things here. But at the moment, right, the Dynamo are sitting in a pretty good position despite the fact that they had a terrible start to the season. And just recently, right, that's part of why I have them in 20th, is their form recently has pushed them up just a little bit above these other kind of minnows in the West. And so going forward, I think Linger can really push this team and help them contend for at least one of those playing spots. Moving on to 19th, I have the Rapids, and the Rapids sitting 9th in the West, so just above Houston in both the standings and in my power rankings. And they just lost to Austin as well in this weekend's action at home, despite getting some players back or being a little bit more healthy just generally. But they still have Zach Steffen out, right, who's been a real saving grace for this team, because this team doesn't play with a lot of possession, first and foremost. But I think I like the outlook going forward for the second half of the season for them. because of just getting that health back. And I've liked what the backup has done anyways, in place of Stefan so far. But like I've said, I'm really high on Kudi Pietro, just adding another element to this team. And they've really been riddled by injuries anyway. So it looks like they're getting healthy at the moment, especially from the lineup I saw in that Austin game, with Bassett coming back, Mihailovic coming. He picked up a bit of an injury in the game before that, but was able to play, and then Navarro coming back. And so I think that main starting 11 is really, really good on paper. They have to mesh it together. And I had this team as kind of like a 5 seed or so in the West. So we'll see if they can live up to that. But I'm still holding out a little bit of faith for this Rapid squad. I think Chris Armas can continue to, work on last year's success. And maybe I have them just a little bit too high based on recent results especially, but that's just my personal opinion. In 18th, I have the Chicago Fire, and the Fire currently sitting 9th in the East after just beating the brakes off DC United 7-1 with those ultra rotated lineups. But the Fire, for maybe some inconsistent results this season, maybe just being an average team as far as the standings go, right, with 7 wins, 4 draws, and 5 losses, they currently have the most goals scored in the Eastern Conference. And yes, that might be stat padding a little bit after that 7-goal performance, but they also have 29 goals conceded, which is 4th worst in the East. And so regardless of what you want to say about this team in terms of can they be contenders in the East at the very least, and just how high can they go, they've been really fun to watch. Greg Berhalter's system has stayed kind of true to what he was saying preseason, and especially in that DC United game we just saw, the players are still performing even if it's not the first team players, right? Kuipers was out of that game. Tom Barlow, of all people, getting a hat trick. And this roster has a lot of talent. Bamba, Zinkernagel, Gutierrez, Kuipers. I mean, it feels like, honestly, no one has really disappointed for this Fire team from an attacking standpoint and a production standpoint. And so 18th, I feel like, is pretty fair, right? Considering they're 9th in the East, and top 18 in this league, right? Top 9 in your conference gets you into the play-in. And so I think that's pretty fair for this Fire team. I think they still have a level to go, but defensively, that's where they've been hurt the most because, number one, their style kind of runs that risk of getting caught out, and generally they just are trying to score more goals than the opposition. They don't really care about holding clean sheets. But now with Brady being on the Gold Cup roster and the fact that this defense is just so thin for real experience, despite the fact that a lot of academy players have stepped up, that might, derail them in certain segments down the stretch. But I feel like this Fire team is just too talented to not at least break this playoff drop this season. Next up in 17th, I have the Earthquakes, and Bruce Arena has gotten this franchise organization back to relevancy at the very least because they're sitting 8th in the West, which is one of those 2 play-in spots, and still they've been super entertaining, which they have been honestly in recent years, but they just haven't been picking up the results and been on the right end of those entertaining games. But this season, right, they've just shown that little bit more consistency. A lot of guys have been stepping up on that back line. And, Arena has gotten the best once again out of Josef Martinez and Chicho Arango, who obviously at the end of last season with RSL really took a dip in form when he was looking like he was going to get Golden Boot. And so this team is probably not going to win anything this season. They are actually in quarterfinals of Open Cup. So excuse me on that. Anything could happen depending on the timing of the matchups, who's injured, who's not for either them or who they're playing. But in terms of MLS and the playoffs, they could be, a bit of a dark horse contender. and maybe cause teams problems just because of the attacking talent they have with Christian Espinoza as well, who's been unbelievable for many seasons in this league. But I feel like now he's getting just a little bit more appreciation now that the team around him is a little bit better and doing well. And that takes a little bit of pressure off of his shoulders to just produce every game, which even though he still does. But yeah, I think the Quakes are pretty, a respectable team this year, right? And I think this is a pretty solid spot for them. Between them and the Fire, I feel like it's basically A and B, 1A, 1B in terms of their styles, just the entertainment value of their games. And I'm just going to give a slight edge to the Earthquakes. Somehow, someway, NYCFC finds its way into 16th despite having just one DP on its roster. And a lot of that has to do with the team's home form, which since the team's existence and inception into this league has really carried them even through some bad seasons. And they sit in 10th in the East, but based off just current form and honestly overperformance, I think they deserve to be in this range. Maybe, you could argue maybe not as high as 16th, maybe a couple spots down, but regardless, this team is just somehow putting in performances despite a lack of talent and a lack of consistent goal scoring, especially, their poor away form. And if it weren't for a couple of games where Alonso Martinez just decides to hit the crossbar or the post on penalty kicks where they've lost out on points at home, then this team could be even higher, right? And their record would just be a little bit better, and they still have a respectable record anyways. And so there's nothing sexy about this team, nothing really too pretty or consistent. They kind of just grind out some results, but hey, they're staying alive in this race in the East, which is really, really stacked. And I think that's been the most impressive part of the season for NYC. In 15th, I have Charlotte FC, and it's maybe a little bit hard to argue, but they are still 8th in the East, and there's a lot of teams worse than them, despite the fact that they've been absolutely terrible on the road this season, right? We know how good they are at home. That's been preached time and time again by whether that be me or any analyst on Apple TV or whatever. Like, this team is still never going to be considered a true contender until they do anything on the road. But they just won in Toronto, right? And Toronto's been taking a lot of L's at home, so maybe take that with a grain of salt. But it's another positive sign. I think their only 2 away wins this season are at Montreal and Toronto. So, and no one has as little of draws this season as Montreal. Montreal has just 1 draw on the season, so 8 wins, 1 draw, and 8 losses. And they also just beat Columbus a couple weeks back to kind of really turn around some bad form before that, where they lost around about 3 or 4 games, most of those being on the road as well. So I think, this is kind of what we've come to expect from the Charlotte team. Defensively, they've maybe dropped off the pace a little bit from seasons past, and Kalina hasn't looked as much of that goalkeeper of the year as last season this season. But at home, their form is going to carry them into probably like that, 6th seed or so. I would expect them to be, just based on how this top 5 of the East is looking right now. I just don't know if they're really going to battle their way back consistently enough. But still, I think 15th that's middle of the pack, literally, of the entire league. And, that sounds about right for this team that, Zaha hasn't fully worked out, but Pep Biel has really taken another step. So there's been kind of just these different levels to this team, and somehow, some way, it's kind of balanced out in some sense because they're still in those kind of lower spots of the playoffs in the East. In 14th, I have the Red Bulls, and I've really talked down on the Red Bulls a lot this season, but it's hard to put them below Charlotte when they just beat Charlotte. I think it was like 4-2 a couple weeks back. And so, once again, they're sitting 6th in the East, and they've once again really beaten up on the really bad teams in the East, which is just something they do. But still, it hasn't really been all that, convincing to me personally, but it's hard to put them lower just based on where they are in the standings at the moment. And I think this is just going to be where they remain, right? They're going to be somewhere between the 6 to 8 range of the standings in the East, because I just don't see them going above some of these other world beaters at the top of the standings. But Choupo-Moting and Forsberg have pushed this team over the hump in games, in moments, and shown their quality. But as a whole, I just don't really believe in this roster, and it's not going to be enough come playoff time. I know we just saw that run last season, but that was against all odds. And to continue to be not naive enough to not, spend on the roster after that enough and make, sign better DPs, just sign better talent overall to compete in the regular season, that's going to hurt you come playoff time, because you're not going to have a high seed, right? And so I just don't see this happening again for the Red Bulls. But at the moment, right, it's hard to knock them down many places. But good on them for still keeping up, and through 17 games, 27 points. Pretty average team, so I'm not going to applaud them too much. In 13th, I have the Revs, and obviously the Revs are still sitting in 11th in the East, but they, I believe now, are on a 9-match unbeaten run, and this switch to this 3-back has really revived Caleb Porter's team after that abysmal start, and everyone is clicking, even though they've lost Langoni for about a month, and also Campagna being injured for about, I think, like 3 to 4 games now. Players have stepped up. Feingold has been scoring out of his mind. Chankalai came back, and Carles Hill, of course, being the main man pulling the strings. They're just grinding out results, whether that be draws or whatever. Maybe they're not all wins, but they're a hard team to beat. And despite the fact they're in 11th, that's only 2 points off the play-in line and 4 points off 7th, which is the first official playoff spot. And so, yes, they're below some of these other teams I've mentioned in the standings at the moment, but on current form, they've really jumped their way up. And at the moment, it looks like they're primed to be contending for sure for one of these, bottom half of the playoff spots. And that's absolutely, objectively, like, just not a crazy thing to say, right? So there's a lot to like with this team. They just have to remain healthy, and defensively, that's really been their bread and butter. That's most of the reason why they've been able to especially go on the road and grind out some really good results. So props to Caleb Porter, because he's been taking a lot of heat. I've given him a lot of heat as well personally, but he's figured things out. On to 12th, and I have the Sounders there, and sitting 6th in the West, and at the moment they're playing Whitecaps, and I'm not going to take that result really too much into account in terms of these standings. I think they're still around this area anyways, but I have them just below the Timbers because they played the Timbers, they haven't beaten them, and I think they've just been slightly underwhelming from an attacking standpoint as well. But the fact that they have this much depth gives them a lot of leeway to handle, this second half of the season. And with Kent coming in, that's really been a boost to this attack. He's seemed really, really comfortable in this league. And at home especially, we know that they just get the results. They did just lose to Minnesota, and finally that kind of style of play for Minnesota from their side of things worked against one of the kind of better to top teams in this league, right? Maybe that'll be a bit of a more difficult thing in the playoffs to retain that form. But regardless, from Seattle's side of things, they have the depth to compete, especially when the schedule gets a bit more loaded. And we've just seen in the past month of May that it was, and that's when they really revived their form. And so under Schmetzer, it's just kind of what we've come to expect. They have slow starts to the season, and then things turn around. But now they have to deal with Club World Cup as one of the 3 teams in that. And so we'll see how much that affects their MLS form once they come back to it. And the fact that we also have Leagues Cup basically directly after, whenever they'll be done with the Club World Cup, we'll see if they can even get out of their group. But I think as for the Sounders, I think this is a pretty fair spot. In 11th, I have the Portland Timbers. The Timbers now sitting 4th in the West after beating St. Louis City at the time of this recording, and that was their 17th game officially. So they're sitting on 29 points, and especially at home now, I think it's the last 8 or 9 unbeaten, including that win with St. Louis. And so Phil Neville has really changed around this team because it was conceding goals on goals last season as much as it was scoring, right? And with losing Evander and Jonathan Rodriguez not really being a key contributor, right, because of his health this season, and then bringing in Da Costa, this team has looked just a little bit different, but it's been kind of just the same thing, but a bit of a different variation of that style, and they've been defensively more sound. And players like Sermon on that back line and others, and Pantemis stepping up into that number 1 goalkeeper spot, getting the job over Crépeau, that's saved them some points, and that's kept them in the top 4 at the moment of the standings in the West. And maybe their underlying numbers aren't as great, and they've been overperforming at times, but they have the talent with Anthony Moreno to just pull results out of the hat, and that was the case today as well against St. Louis City. And they just seem primed to be just a little bit more consistent, and especially if they can get a home playoff spot, which they're at the moment pushing for, and doing it through home form, right? Then they're looking like a real dangerous squad with just a little bit less of flaws from last season. So that's already an improvement on this team. And going forward, really no one is injured or anything along those lines. They're not losing really too much to the international windows, and they should be primed to continue this form going forward. We move into our top 10 of the power rankings, starting with LAFC in the 10th spot. Now, LAFC has not had the most dominant season by any means recently, and a lot of it hasn't been convincing, right? But at home, especially, they've really been almost flawless. And that Club World Cup game against Club America to get into it has to boost them up just a little bit in my books, because that is an impressive win, regardless of the context of the match and how they got the opportunity. And Club America's kind of tired legs maybe going into that match. LAFC is still one of the top 10 teams in this league at the moment, in my opinion, just on current form. They're currently sitting in 5th in the West at the moment at the time of this recording, and looking at the moment primed to beat Kansas City in today's action. And they will be losing Under. He got injured, and it seems like that's going to keep him out until about the time his loan contract expires this summer in June. And regardless, Ordaz has stepped up. Martinez has, just leveled up a little bit in this season, even though he's still so young. And defensively, right, they've still been one of these elite teams, and that's been why they've been really hard to beat. They just don't give up much. And even though, and Giroud has actually been scoring a couple of goals here and there recently. And so, although I don't think he's, really going to turn his form around all that much and help this team be contending for any sort of championship, things are looking a little bit more better for LAFC. And now they have the Club World Cup to look forward to, and we'll see how this summer treats them. In 9th, I have the Columbus Crew, and on current form, I get that it's hard to justify maybe even the 9th spot because they're 6 winless now, only 2 losses though. But on the flip side, they started the season as one of the last 2 teams to remain unbeaten before they ended up losing to Miami. And now, to add insult to injury, during this unbeaten run, they lost to Miami again and got the break speed off of them 5-1 in Miami. And so, of course, Wilfred Nancy's side has had finishing issues all season, and that's natural when you lose Cucho. But the system has still paid dividends and gotten just risen the level of all of these players, right? And as a collective, this team has still shown elite signs and can give anyone a tough time, especially when it comes to competing with the top teams in this league. But it's going to be a crucial summer for this squad, whether that be around Nancy's future or just actually signing crucial replacements, because although that Gazdag signing was supposed to be, level this team up even more from a goal scoring perspective, he has been dry, and he's been given that freedom to roam, but they need a true number 9. And although Russell Rowe has been really, really good, for how young he is and the role he's being asked to fill, still I think they need to go and spend some money to get back to that consistent level, because it's really just down to that quality standpoint. The patterns of play are there, the style is there, but at the end of the day, you have to put the ball in the net, and that's what's really hurt the Crew in some of these matchups against high-tier opposition. Miami is an 8th for me, just above the Crew, after they just beat them in their last match ahead of the Club World Cup, which they're one of the 3 teams representing, with LAFC and the Sounders. And I don't have them higher because although they just beat the Crew were also, like I said, on a downward spiral. And Miami entering that match in the past month and a half since they've got embarrassed against the Whitecaps in that Champions Cup semifinal have also been in some pretty bad form. They also lost to their rivals in Orlando, and a couple of results against Montreal, and now the Crew obviously still being an elite team, is not going to bump them up higher than some of these teams we have remaining, as you can see, and that we'll get to. This team still looks its age, and Messi, I feel like, especially hasn't been consistent enough. Yes, I think he just, 2 goals against the Crew and an assist, and that's fantastic because he's showing up in those big games, right? With these statement moments. But as far as the whole season has been concerned, there's just been too many dips, and at times it seems like they've been really continuing to play the villains in terms of complaining about too many things, getting into it with the referees when they just don't get these little things their way. And from a mentality standpoint, I think that's also gone against them as to why they haven't been, performing as consistently as they would have hoped to contend for another Supporter Shield back-to-back. 7th, I have Orlando City, and Orlando was in an unbelievable stretch of double-digit games unbeaten before eventually losing to Atlanta. Part of that loss being a red card that they suffered, and then also now losing to the Fire at home, and they haven't played since then. But it's the halfway point of their season, 17 games, 7 wins, 6 draws, 4 losses. And this team has been really dynamic, honestly. Marco Pasalic has completely, I feel like, filled the roles of Facundo Torres, if not even risen a level above that this season in his first season here. And those are big shoes to fill. And everyone else, regardless, Ojeda has been fantastic. Muriel has really stepped up a level after really looking like a bust from the season he came last season, his first season. And I know Gillespie had a stinker in, I believe it was that Fire match, but he's held so many shutouts, as well as this defense, which also features a great U.S. youth player in Freeman as right back, that there's a lot to like about this team. The addition of Atuesta with Gerbet also coming into the fold when Atuesta was injured. You have kind of like this midfield depth on this team now that has really been competing for playing time. And Oscar Pereira just continues to make this Orlando City team at least the middle of the pack playoff team that is still, potentially contending for one of these higher spots. I mean, the difference between 2nd in the East and 7th is 3 points at the moment. Cincinnati on 30 points in 2nd, Orlando in 7th at 27 points. So we're really just talking about these minor things here, and it's really about recent form at the moment. And really, this is the run-in right? You know, it's 17 games left, right, for most of these teams, but we're in this run-in standpoint. This is the second half of the season, the business end of the season, where these teams are going to show us who is really going to stand out and secure those top 4 playoff spots. And Orlando, of all teams, definitely has a case to be made for contending. Cincinnati is in 6th for me, and yes, they've been in some terrible form lately. 4 winless, including a loss to DC United at home recently, which is the real bad-looking one. But also part of that winless run was the Hell is Real Derby, 1-1 draw against Columbus. That's not a poor result by any means. And, those other bad results, yes, I understand. But, in that Atlanta game, Hagelin got injured early, and that caused disruption. And when you look at it in a vacuum like that, that's its own kind of thing. But defensively as well, that's what's really been killing Cincinnati in this current stretch of games, despite the fact that outside of Hagelin getting injured, they've really gotten healthy again. But regardless, they're still sitting second in the East on 30 points and only, a couple points back of Philly, only 4 points back. So Pat Noonan is a fantastic coach, one of the best in this league. This roster has Kevin Denke and Evander. And although that combination maybe hasn't been as straightforward in terms of them combining for goals specifically, they've both gotten their good share of goal contributions anyways through the system that this team plays. And so they've fallen some spots. I think 6th is still pretty fair because I think the other teams in the East at the moment are obviously still below them and have been doing some work in terms of catching up to Cincinnati. And so I don't think it deserves to drop all the way down to maybe, even 3 or 4 more spots. But they do have a lot of work to do to turn this around and continue to maintain this, whether that be Eastern Conference 1 seed push or Supporter Shield push going forward. In the top 5, we start with Nashville in 5th. And Nashville has been super fun to watch this season. BJ Callahan has really taken this team and turned it around. And Sam Surridge, especially, one of the top candidates right at the moment, top scorers for the Golden Boot, only behind Baribo. And, everyone's kind of just gotten better from this system. And the midfield as well has been that spark with Yazbek, Kwasem, and Brugman at times. And Mukhtar just hasn't had to take on that level of responsibility or carry the entire load on his shoulders, right? There's a lot of talent outside of him now, and they've been just very direct, have really been able to switch the play, put a lot of pressure with these waves of pressure through the midfield, through possession of the ball, and it's just a really fun product to watch for Nashville. And just especially in the more recent form, they've been very, very hard to beat. They drew at Columbus and advanced in the Open Cup to the quarterfinals, beating Orlando City while Orlando City was in that amazing stretch of being unbeaten in league play. And it's just the team handling business right now, whichever way you cut it. And they've risen above some other teams in the East that they may not be above in the standings right now, but on current form and with how tight the standings are literally on points, I mean, that's really what is separating them for me in these power rankings. In 4th, I have Minnesota United, and they're sitting 3rd in the West. And honestly, part of the reason why they're not maybe just a little higher is because of the style of play they run and the fact that they are in the West, which just generally seems like the weaker conference, which is not to discredit them entirely or anything like that. But as we've seen from the East, it just seems like it's much more of a bloodbath, and you have to be far more on top of things and consistent to end up in those top 3 in the East, I feel like, when it all comes down to it at the end of the season. But Minnesota, regardless, under Eric Ramsey, they've progressed once again another level, and that statement win at the Sounders was just that. That was one of those instances where it feels like for this Minnesota team, when you get into the later part of the season with the style of play they run, since they just have one of the lowest possession rates in the league, that tends to extra work off the ball. And when you're in a grind of games and when you get into the playoffs, is that going to take its toll from a physical standpoint and lead to a lack of energy when it comes down to the most important games of the season down the stretch? But they beat the Sounders, who are one of the, best possession teams in the league from a percentage standpoint in terms of retaining possession, and beat them in their own backyard. And so that was a good win for them to kind of give them that belief that they can do this and that it's not just going to work against maybe some average to lower place teams, whatever conference that may be in. So we're going to see if they can continue to be this dominant with this style of play, but it's a team that knows who it is, and they have more than enough of the personnel and depth to be successful doing it. So I understand why it's, Eric Ramsey continues to have this method and these tactics, and they have some fun players to watch. Obviously, Oluwase, Hlongwane, Yeboah, who's maybe been a little bit out of favor with Oluwase taking on that form with the goal scoring, but still, I think they are rich in depth and spoiled with it, and they deserve to be in at least the top 5. And third, it's San Diego FC. This team is just another one of those expansion teams that is taking the league by storm. Started off the season in fantastic form and then suffered, I think, like 3 losses in a row, but since then has turned its form around once again and is just getting the results. Ingvartsen finally back. I think he came off the bench in their last game, so that's fantastic. But it doesn't really matter because this team tactically is so fluid, whether it be Valakari playing as a false 9 or Angel coming in, and they just have the depth to not really play this position-based type of possession play because they're pulling the opposition into these other areas and getting players to shift on their own end, that it just really confuses teams, and they're just, the quality on the ball in terms of the passing is just so good. The level is so high, and so that's why they're able to execute this style of play, and they're just running up the table. Honestly, they're only 5 points back of Vancouver at the moment and sitting in second in the West. And there's a lot to like about the San Diego team. And as long as they remain healthy, they have stars on this team with Chucky Lozano, Dreyer. That midfield is just absolutely bossing it. Maybe defensively they've taken a step back in the past month and a half or so. But regardless, with the style of play they run, that's been the recipe for success. And those are the types of teams that have won hardware in the past 3 or so years in MLS. And that just seems to be the trend in terms of what the best teams in this league are turning into, in terms of they are the ones that have some of the best possession rate and actually dictate the game and do positive things with the ball. And that's exactly what San Diego is doing. Second, I got the Philadelphia Union. Bradley Carnell got fired from the St. Louis City job, took on this role, which he knew entering it that he would not be getting really much support, if any, in terms of spending, because Philly is one of those markets and with the owners that rely a lot on the youth academy for developing talent and going straight to the first team and building part of the roster out of that, and then also just not spending money on DPs. But regardless of that, Bradley Carnell has taken that first season success in the inaugural season with St. Louis and completely turned this Union team around for a team that many thought entering the season, because Jim Curtin left and was also getting the most out of a limited roster. He's been passing this test with flying colors, Bradley Carnell has. And Ty Bariba, once again, leading the league in goals at the moment, continuing that form that he had in the second half of last season when he finally got playing time once the player left for Feyenoord, Carranza, sorry about that, Took me a second to get that name. But this team is just clicking. The midfield with Lukic, with Sullivan, and of course Wagner leading the way from the back line from a production standpoint. Like the talent is there on this roster, and with that two striker setup as well, that's not something you really see a lot of in just world football nowadays, but in MLS as well. And that link up has to be strong, and that's been a big case of why the Union are able to really kind of progress the ball in behind a lot and find success catching teams out in behind. So sitting first in the East, they're only 1 point off the Supporters Shield at the moment, since Vancouver in first on that. And Vancouver's only lost one game this season, so we'll get to them. But the Union deservedly in top 2, leading the East, which of course is the harder conference, but it's hard to put them in first when you have the Whitecaps. And of course in first we got Vancouver. They got the crown at the moment. Yes, they got embarrassed in Champions Cup to Cruz Azul, but Sorensen has this team flying to levels that we have not seen before out of the Whitecaps specifically. Maybe not really this type of dominance from any Canadian team in MLS. And I think this team with this mentality, with the depth they have, and especially the talent they have in midfield, everyone that's stepped up, I don't think that this Whitecaps team is going to crumble from that loss to Cruz Azul in the second half of this MLS season. I don't think that's going to take its toll from a mental standpoint, because I think strictly in MLS play, the Whitecaps are head and shoulders above really most teams, and they just come at you in waves, and it's so relentless with the talent they have, not even to mention Ryan Gauld returning. You know, maybe they might drop a little bit in terms of Supporter Shield form, but at the moment, it just doesn't seem like as well that many teams outside of, you know, really you could argue almost everyone but Philly has seen some really concerning dips in form through the first half of the season. And you could argue that, you know, even if the Whitecaps might have a little bit of a 3 or 4 game stretch at some point where they pick up draws instead of wins or so on, everyone else is going to probably have that too, because outside of the Whitecaps, it doesn't seem like anyone has really been just running the table. And it doesn't really matter who starts for them, right? They've found production from all players, and the system itself has been what's been giving this team the identity and the belief that they can pull out results. And it's just all about that response, right? You could look at it from either way, but I think personally that from what we've seen, this one loss in Champions Cup, although it is obviously the most important competition in North America, I don't think it's going to derail their season whatsoever, and they're going to comfortably at least retain one of these top 4 playoff spots. But once again, they're just a really hard team to beat, and in this season, it just seems like no one has really risen to their level, and someone else is going to have to prove it in the second half if they want to take that Supporter Shield away from the Whitecaps. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Let me know what your thoughts are on the power rankings. We're, of course, halfway through the season, and the second half is really going to show us who can rise above the rest and maintain this form from the first half of the season. Let me know what your power rankings are, what you would change, and what your thoughts are so far on the first half of the MLS season, and what you're most looking forward to in this second half as we wind down into the summer months with, of course, other competitions such as the Club World Cup taking away some of teams from MLS action, and then also Leagues Cup coming up, which will make the run-in towards the playoffs that much harder. So once again, please make sure to like this video down below, guys. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I really appreciate your support, and I'll see you all in the next video.